Welcome, and yes, in today's video we are going to be recreating SpaceX's Starlink mission inside of Kerbal Space Program. And because this is Kerbal Space Program, we've given it a fitting name of Operation Kerblink. If you're not interested in watching me build this ship, you can go ahead and skip to the time on screen, and if you are interested, let's go ahead and get started talking about that. So pretty much all I did to make this satellite was I started off with a small probe core, and then I put two structural panels on there where I added all of our accessories, our antennas, our fuel tank, solar panels, and our thrusters, and our reaction wheel. I added all of that to the structural panels, and that's pretty much entirely how I made this these satellites themselves. They're pretty simple. But how I deployed them was I put these satellites onto an engine plate with some decouplers, and then I stacked those engine plates on top of each other. That way we could get a bunch of satellites into one fairing. Now I did have to make sure that I didn't put the shrouds onto the engine plates, because if I did put the shrouds on the engine plates and didn't disable them, it would ruin the entire mission when I go to deploy it, as you would have that shroud just surrounding all of those satellites, and they wouldn't have anywhere to go. They'd just be contained inside of the shroud. So make sure if you're trying to recreate this that you do disable the shrouds. But the rest of the ship is really simple. We just have a second stage with a Rhino engine, and then we have a first stage booster with, I believe, 9 Merlin equivalent, the equivalent of Merlin engines, at least the most equivalent that we have in Kerbal Space Program. But here we are going for our first ascent. Notice I say first, and that's because doesn't necessarily go quite to plan. I did forget to strut down the engine plate, and it did cause the Kraken to come and mess up everything. I thought I was going to be able to save it, and that's why you can see me unpausing it, but no, it was just too far gone. So you can see me here strutting it up and making sure everything is all nice and tidy, and then we're going off for our second ascent. Now, one thing I will note about this mission is that it absolutely destroys your frame rate. So if you do want to recreate this mission in any way, I would recommend that you do not do this on any save that is of any importance to you. So like, and I definitely don't recommend doing this on any career save, because there's really no point in doing this. And it'll destroy your frame rate. So just keep that in mind if you do want to recreate this mission. But with that being said, here, as you just saw, we did just go into our second stage, where we have that nice big Rhino engine getting us into our orbit, where we deploy all 45 of our Kerblink satellites. And yes, unfortunately, we do only have 45 satellites. Well, that does seem like a lot of individual ships to be orbiting around Kerbin inside of Kerbal Space Program at one time. It is shy of the amount that the real Starlink mission does deploy at a time. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the real Starlink missions deploy 60 satellites with each launch. Unfortunately, due to the constraints of my PC not being able, or barely being able, to do 45, we definitely were not able to do 60, at least enjoyably enough for me to play while recording this. Even at 45, I was limited to like 10 frames per second when playing. So you can only imagine what 60 would have been like. But as you can see here, we are going for a radial in-burn, trying to make a normal or equalized orbit. But as you can see here, I kind of failed at that. But don't worry, I will go ahead and we will fix this. As you see, I'm setting that maneuver right there. But unfortunately, I did cut the maneuver out of the video just out of time's sake, because the video already is, I believe, a little over like 10 minutes long. So I didn't want to make it much longer, because I felt like it was already kind of pushing it. But we're about to transition into our first deploy. So notice I said first. Just like our launches, we did kind of run into some issues here. But as you can see here, I'm getting our ship nice and orientated for a deploy. That way we can go ahead and spin our ship around. That way we can use centrifugal force to our benefit and get these satellites deployed into a nice separated orbit. But I'll just go ahead and shut up so you guys can see exactly the result of our first deploy attempt. Well, as you can see, it didn't necessarily go to plan, like I did say. Um, I don't know how well you guys can see this because of YouTube's um, super crappy compression, but all those satellite pieces were just scattered across the just floating away. But here we are going for our second attempt. My first thought or strategy in how to fix this, because I tried this multiple times and this kept happening, was to go ahead and split the deploy into two. So what I did was I set up staging to where it's only going to deploy half of the satellites at once, and then it will deploy the second half after we deploy the first. But it doesn't necessarily work either. It's not as frame rate destroying when we deploy this, but as you can see, it still does blow up, and pieces of Kerblink satellites are scattered everywhere. Now, I will say, even though this is completely messed up and it didn't do what I wanted it to do, it was oddly satisfying seeing all of these little pieces just floating off into space. But yeah, as you can see, I got a little bit frustrated and just kind of bursted through some of them. But here we are at our third attempt. And what I decided to do, because the other splitting it into just two launches or two deploys didn't work, so I figured I would just go ahead and try to deploy each layer at a time. So what I did was I separated each engine plate into its own staging. That way we will hopefully not have to deal with our satellites getting blown up this time. But as you can hear that cinematic, dramatic music popping in, we are about to go ahead and start our third deploy. So I'll go ahead and let you guys just, take in the full view and ambiance of this. Yes, there we have it. Our first successful Kerblink deploy. You don't know how happy I was when this actually worked. I had probably already spent close to 2 hours in doing this entire mission, not even counting the amount of times I tested this before recording this video. And I really don't know why it wasn't working in this video, because when I tested it before, doing it the setup that I had at the beginning of the video, it actually worked perfectly fine. I didn't necessarily have any issues when I had deployed it in my testing launches, but for whatever reason, when I decided to actually go ahead and record the video, it of course didn't want to cooperate, and so we had the outcome that we had. But here we are deploying our last little bunch of Kerblink satellites with the cinematic view. And here we are now deploying the individual satellite, or I guess kind of getting it into an operational state, I should say, rather, in an attempt to make these satellites as similar or as close to the real thing as possible. I did go ahead and put the ion thruster there. One, just because the real satellites do have an ion thruster, but also two, because it honestly gave us the most delta V with the least amount of fuel. So it just made the most sense. Which, to be honest, I wonder, that's probably why they use it on the real thing. But regardless, as you can see here, we are jumping to our second Kerblink satellite, and that's another thing actually that makes the Kerblink mission, Operation Kerblink, different from the real Starlink mission, is that we don't have autonomous satellite deploying like Starlink does. I just got to do this the old-fashioned way and manually orientate each of these vessels into their specific orbit. But as you'll probably see, or not as you probably will, you will see, I was a bit lazy and I didn't actually put each of these satellites into their own orbit, and nor did I go and actually open each one of these satellites. It's 45 satellites that I have to individually switch to in the tracking station, and that's just, it would have taken too long. And I really, honestly, like I said, I was already spending like close to 2 hours doing this one mission or launch itself. so I really didn't want to have to spend any more time on it. But here, as you can see, this is the satellite that was damaged when we had that fairing mishap in the beginning. But really all it did was just knock off one of its relay antennas. So it's not much, or it's not that big of a problem. But you know, it still is not completely operational. So as you'll see here, I did go ahead and note it. That way, you know, the Kerbins back at the Kerbal Space Program can go ahead and probably get this thing deorbited. That way we don't have to run into any issues where, you know, it collides with any of the other Kerblink satellites and causes any problems in the future. So I did make sure to note that and make sure the Kerbals know that that one is damaged. But with that really brings us to the end of this mission for the most part. All that was left to do really is to get these satellites operational and then get them into their respective orbits. But given that we don't have an autonomous system for these to deploy themselves, and I'm not going to sit here and deploy all 45, we'll just pretend that they're all being deployed and they're all actually in an operational state. And then in any second now, we will be going into the tracking station where we're going to be speeding up the time warp really fast so we can get all of our Kerblink satellites spread apart into a fairly spread orbit. That way we have the most coverage over Kerbin. But that does bring our video to an end, and this was actually my very first video on this channel and very first video of Kerbal Space Program. So if you guys did enjoy it, I'd really appreciate you guys giving it a like, and if you have any feedback, I'd really love to hear it. So please leave a comment down below, and thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.